Good morning, Smarter News. We're going to do something a little different today. We're having coffee outside. We've changed locations, and we're actually going to lead with a story that's more about agreement in Washington, D.C. rather than disagreement. So many of our top stories have to do with friction, and that's how you get two sides. You have a lead of a story or something terrible happened. But I thought, you know what, let's start with this story. And it's a story that we need to cover, even though in some ways it's shining a light on bipartisanship. I wish we didn't have to cover it at all. But the House of Representatives just voted to award the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor that Congress can award to an American citizen, to the 13 service members who were killed in Afghanistan as the United States was withdrawing. What's incredible to think about today is that all of these service members were killed on August 26th, exactly 2 months ago. And so it's been just about 60 days. It's, roughly 60 days since their death. The House of Representatives voted to award the Congressional Gold Medal to them. Now that legislation will go to the Senate. The Senate will vote on it. And eventually, the likelihood, of course, is that it will be awarded to this group. What's interesting about the Congressional Gold Medal is that it's a award that dates back to the beginning of America. In fact, the first recipient was George Washington. And throughout the years, it mainly went to people that participated in the military, but then it expanded. So even though it's still a very select group of people, it includes Frank Sinatra, for example, or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or the Navajo code talkers. So it's a very interesting group, and it's something I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on as we see this legislation move through Congress. But I thought that this was important for you to know. Republicans and Democrats come together to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice. It got me thinking, though, there were a lot of people injured in that attack as well. And we had the luxury of moving away from this news, but the families of those impacted have not. And I don't want to lose sight not only of the families who lost loved ones killed in action, but also those that are dealing with injuries. And so I'm going to follow up with the Department of Defense today. Maybe there's a little bit of news I can share on that. I want to make sure that stays as something that we're talking about. So that's something you need to know today. Also today, we have a major meeting. The FDA is taking place, the FDA Advisory Panel. In fact, I just screenshot what it looks like. You can watch it on YouTube. I'll put this link up for you, but it's going to be several hours long. What the advisory panel is looking at is whether or not to give emergency use authorization to the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine for kids 5 to 11. So we already have emergency use authorization for those 12 and older, and all-out approval for the Pfizer vaccine for a particular group. But this is another group that we've been watching very closely because it's the youngest among us, right? Of course, we have the infants, but this 5 through 11-year-old group is important. These are school-age kids, and a question about whether or not this is the next step for the vaccine. Based on the FDA briefing that they put together, the models that they are showing, a couple things. The data that was provided from Pfizer showed that out of this several thousand group of kids, that there were no deaths and no adverse reactions. The model that they put together, based on the data that they have, shows that there's a greater benefit to children for taking this vaccine rather than just not having that sort of protection. That said, there's some very interesting things in this briefing that I thought was worth your attention. One was the fact that, when we're looking at kids in COVID and severe cases, we're looking at a very, very, very low amount. The data that's in the FDA briefing is like 146 deaths out of more than 770,000 in America for this age group, 5 to 11. So your chances of severe cases is very, very low in this group. This group particularly comes out to 0.02%, more or less. And what's interesting is that mirrors what we're seeing from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Let me show you this. This shows the chart of what happened in COVID-19 in America. You see that the turquoise is for adults, and the kids are that navy line. So you can see that it rose as well with the Delta variant, but we're seeing many more cases in adults. In the briefing, there's still a question about asymptomatic spread, and what that looks like in kids. The range was like 15 to 50% of cases they think could be asymptomatic. As someone that's covered this over the last 2 years, the fact that we're still trying to determine asymptomatic spread at all is notable to me. The other thing that I thought was also just stood out was that the only approved treatment for COVID-19 remains remdesivir. Yeah, you have emergency use authorization for monoclonal antibodies, but remdesivir actually isn't available to kids younger than 12. So we still have so many questions about this virus. And what I'm going to be very curious about is how the FDA advisory panel handles that question about mortality. What is the risk, the real risk to kids, and how you calculate the benefits of the vaccine? Yes, they put together a model that they believe shows that there's a benefit here, but there have been those that have voiced concerns about that because the risk is very low in kids. And so if you see a headline number one that says the FDA advisory panel approves this emergency use authorization for kids, no, it has to go through the CDC and a guidance before it. You're not going to be able to show up tomorrow if you want to give your 7-year-old this vaccine and get it. It's going to have to go through a little bit of process, which moves us into next week. But if the FDA advisory panel does approve emergency use or recommends approval for use of emergency use authorization, the FDA is likely to follow in the CDC, and then we're on our way, which is the timeline for some kids to be fully vaccinated could be by Christmas. So that's one thing to note. I'm going to be curious when we talk about this in the news, there's always two sides, right? Either they're coming after your kids or I'm first in line to give my kid a vaccine. And what I'm curious about this advisory panel is whether or not we see something more nuanced. There's definitely a higher risk to kids that have pre-existing conditions. So could we see the advisory panel say, yeah, emergency use authorization, but for kids that are most at risk as we await more data? I don't know. That's the headlines I'm going to be looking at today for that. But you should know that it's taking place. This is the first of this stage of vaccines moving potentially to the younger age group. Moderna now is going to be following, and you will see others. I just saw last week, there's more than 100 vaccines around the world that are in some stage of clinical trial. There's a lot. So we were just talking about a few. And so I want you to know that this is happening today. Final thing has to do with a little international news, and I want to take you to Africa for this because there's been some headlines about what's happening in Sudan, and it might not be something that you're like talking about on a regular basis. I'm not. But let me show you this map real quick because I think this kind of hits home. Sudan is a very geographically strategic, important country. It's also a very large country. You can see to the east, you have Saudi Arabia, to the north, Egypt and Libya. It's very rich in resources, and in recent decades, it was under a dictatorship. It also was one of the very few nations in the world that the United States designated a state sponsor of terrorism because of its support for terrorist activity, terrorist groups, and terrorist leaders. In fact, Osama bin Laden, lived in Sudan. So in the time that he was in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, he also lived in Sudan. In the final few months of the Trump administration, there was a move to remove Sudan from the designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. They emerged from a dictatorship. There was a question about a move towards democracy and whether or not they could build alliances with other Middle East countries that were moving towards recognizing the state of Israel. So these are alliances that are important to the United States. Can the U.S. pull Sudan in to kind of shift it to a more pro-West posture? That would be really important where it is in Africa, and also to make sure it doesn't return to a hotbed for terrorism. We don't want to see dictatorship there. And so that was the move that happened in the last year or so. But over the last 2 days, the move towards democracy really grinded to a halt. And there's a military coup taking place there, although there's a lot of mixed information because the telecommunication lines have been cut down. I just want you to be aware of that happening as we're moving our gaze away from Afghanistan and in some cases away from the Middle East. There still is a question about Africa and it being an area where there's a lot of potential support or the availability for support of terrorist groups. There's terrorist groups already there. It's one of the reasons Sudan has a history of that. It's one of the reasons we're watching it. But also geopolitically, to see a country potentially make a move that could be more aligned with the U.S. and then suddenly it hits the brakes, that stops all economic aid to the country that's already struggling. And when there's instability in one area, that can lead to instability everywhere. So you don't want to see instability in a lot of countries because it has the potential to spill over. And so I just want you to be aware of that part of the world. All right, guys, I've talked enough for today. Hope you've enjoyed it's fall weather in Texas. It's like going to be 80 degrees today. It's chilly. I mean, look, I'm wearing a sweatshirt. But I hope this is helpful for you guys. If you have questions or comments, let me know. I'll try to grab them in the comment section. I'll keep you updated on the FDA advisory panel. And all these stories with links are on our website if you want to check them out and read a little bit more. I think that's a chainsaw. It's my cue to go. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you soon.